A fishing boat captain is interviewing job applicants for the position of fish sorter on his trawler boat. He sees several candidates throughout the day who are all quite good until finally he gets to the last candidate. He asks his wife to show the gentleman in, and to his surprise, in walks a blind man, complete with white stick, dark glasses, and a guide dog. The captain is a little taken aback by this sight and says to the blind man that the job involves sorting fish and that, although he prides himself on being an equal opportunity employer, maybe due to the man's disability, he may find the job a little difficult. The man thinks for a moment, and then tells the captain that, although he's been blind since a child, he has found that his other senses have become much more acute and therefore compensate for his loss of sight. The captain contemplates this for a moment, and then thinks to himself, well, seeing as this is the last interview of the day, he doesn't particularly want to be seen as discriminating against this man. He decides that he'll give him a chance. He takes him down to the coal store in the hold, and takes out several boxes from that morning's catch, and asks the blind man to see if he can identify what is in each box. The blind man approaches the first box and takes hold of one of the fish, and immediately says, "This is a box of plaice." The captain is quite impressed, and asks him how that he knows that it's a box of plaice. To which the blind man says, well, it's obvious. The fish, they're flat, which means that it must be plaice. And he's correct. The captain says, okay, and leads him to the next box. The blind man reaches in and picks up a fish, turns it over, and then licks his fingers. He then thinks for a moment and says to the captain, this is a box of haddock. Once again, he's correct. The captain looks at him in amazement and says, how do you know it's haddock? It could be cod. The blind man says, well, it feels like cod, and it smells like cod, but it tastes like haddock, so I'm going to go with haddock. The captain accepts this, but he's not quite sure. He's starting to be a little bit suspicious, so he takes him to the third box. The blind man reaches in and immediately pulls back his hand and says, I'm not putting my hand in there. That's a box of live lobsters. The captain is impressed, because it was, and asks the blind man how he knew that the box contained lobsters and not crabs, or other fish for that matter. The blind man says, well, he could feel their hard scales, but most of all, he could hear their claws snapping. The captain is amazed, but doesn't quite believe that this man is blind. He's just a little bit too good to be true. He says to the blind man, look, you are just too good. I don't believe that you are really blind. I think you're having me on. And he asks the blind man to wait in the hall for a few moments, while he just pops out to set up the final test for the interview. The captain returns a few minutes later and leads the blind man up to his cabin. But before they go in through the door, the captain turns to the blind man and says, look, for this test you must identify whatever it is, using any of your senses apart from your sense of touch. You can't use your hands or touch it in any way. The blind man smiles and agrees, and they're going through the door into the captain's cabin. And there, on the table, on the map table, is the captain's wife, absolutely stark naked. The captain watches the blind man for any shock or surprise, but there is none. So he leads the blind man up to the table. The blind man stops for a moment and listens very carefully, but the captain's wife is absolutely still and silent. He thinks for a moment, and then he sniffs the air, pauses, and then he licks his lips, as if tasting the very air itself. He pauses once again, and then turns to the captain and says, "I'm not quite sure. Is it possible to turn it over?" The captain agrees, and the captain's wife very carefully and silently turns over. The blind man once again sniffs the air, and then licks his lips once again, and a knowing smile comes across his face. The captain looks at him and says, "Well, do you know what it is?" And the blind man, a big grin on his face, says, "Well, at first I thought it was the leftovers from yesterday's catch, but when you turned it over it was obvious. It's the toilet door from the fishing trawler."